Hello. More information coming in this morning on the Omicron variant. And it isn't, I'm afraid, hugely cheering. 160 cases officially identified here, maybe many more. Both England and Scotland are affected. We know this spreads very quickly. And yes, vaccinated people are being infected. So this leaves all of us with immediate Christmas dilemmas. To party or not to party, to snog or not to snog, see older relatives for a mince pie and a hug, or pass on that this year. In normal times, we would look to the government for clear direction, but during this week, the messages from those in charge have been so confused and so contradictory, it's really very hard to know what they think at all. Perhaps, at least for the moment, it's up to us to make up our own minds about how to behave this Christmas. Anyway, let's see if we can clear some of this up with the Deputy Prime Minister, Dominic Raab, who also has big criminal justice announcements today. From the very latest scientific analysis on the threat of Omicron, I'll be talking to the South African scientist staring down his microscope at the epicentre of this new threat, Professor Willem Hanekom, and to the UK government advisor, Professor Mark Woolhouse. With more than 200,000 children already out of school because of COVID, I'll be joined by the Children's Commissioner, Dame Rachel de Souza. And after a week which hasn't been entirely easy for the royal family, I've been talking to one of the Queen's greatest admirers and her latest biographer, Joanna Lumley. Reviewing the news, Good Morning Britain's Susanna Reid and The Guardian's deputy political editor, Jess Elgott. But before all of that, the news with Roger Johnson.
Andrew, thank you. Good morning. The rules around travelling into the UK have been tightened again in a bid to control the spread of the new Omicron variant of COVID-19. Anyone arriving into the UK from Tuesday morning will require proof of a negative COVID test taken within 48 hours before departure. And the so-called red list of destinations has been expanded to include Nigeria. The killers of 6-year-old Arthur Labinio Hughes are to have their prison sentences reviewed after claims that they were not long enough. The Attorney-General will look again at the sentences given to Arthur's father and stepmother. The Prime Minister is expected to announce an inquiry into Arthur's death later. Several football clubs paid tribute to Arthur during Saturday's games, including Birmingham City, the club which Arthur supported, where fans applauded in the 6th minute of their game. At least 13 people are now known to have died after a volcano erupted on the island of Java. Officials on the island say that dozens more have been injured, many suffering severe burns from the huge ash cloud which escaped Mount Semeru. The volcano has been in a state of near constant eruption for decades. A blast of wintry weather is sweeping across parts of Scotland and northern England today, where nearly 5,000 homes are still without electricity, 9 days after the damage caused by Storm Arwen. Army troops will continue supporting residents in remote areas, including 80 Royal Artillery personnel who've been deployed to Northumberland. The Business Secretary, Kwasi Kwarteng, will visit Bishop Auckland in County Durham later today. And drugs gangs will be targeted and addicts helped in a new strategy costing £700 million over 3 years. The plan, which is expected to be announced by ministers tomorrow, will see a large proportion of the cash going to prisons and the police to tackle dealers. But addicts will be taken out of the criminal justice system and into healthcare and recovery programmes. That's it from me. The next news here on BBC One is at 1 o'clock. Back to you now, Andrew.
Many thanks for that. And now to the front pages and some proper news stories. The front page of the Sunday Telegraph, COVID pill to be ruled out before Christmas, and that's going to allow people to treat themselves at home. We'll talk more about that, of course. And the Sunday Times has a really interesting story here about the doctors and nurses who are absolutely furious as unvaccinated people fill up emergency beds which are really needed for other people. We are still human beings and we still get angry at things that we think aren't just, says one nurse. And a doctor from Birmingham says, when you can't provide the services you feel you need for the rest of your community and other patients who've got life-limiting illnesses, there is a degree of frustration and anger. And he says it's infuriating and frustrating to see those people filling up the beds there. The Mirror is turning back to another political aspect of this story. Of course, the Number 10 party on the 18th of December, this time last year, at a time when lots of people were not allowed, in fact, most people were not allowed to socialise at all, and people were dying. Our loved ones died while Number 10 partied is their front page. Another couple of interesting stories on the front page of The Observer. One particular, if you're looking for good news on the Andrew Marr programme this morning, look away now, because this is Sir Jeremy Farrar, Director of the Wellcome Trust, Government Advisor until recently, and he says that we have squandered our progress on COVID. I must read you this paragraph. This is him talking. The longer this virus continues to spread in largely unvaccinated populations globally, the more likely it is that a variant that can overcome our vaccines and treatments will emerge, he says. If that happens, we could be close to square one. So that's cheered you all up. And finally, Prince William on the front page of Mail on Sunday. He's on the front page of a lot of papers talking about mental health. And again, we may come to that story later on. But let's start again with COVID, Jessica, because there's a terrifying piece of visualisation, piece of art in The Observer about this new Omicron variant. I don't know if it's realistic, but it looks like a kind of bristling Death Star from what they've drawn.
Yeah, it looks terrifying, and even more terrifying in this, the crucial questions. None of the questions have actually really got answers. Loads of this is the great unknown. The two really severe things that we don't know about it is how fast it infects people and how much it can evade vaccines. But the early news so far is very worrying. One expert quoted here saying that he thinks it can infect up to 6 times as many people as Delta that fast.
Well, we have news on that later in the programme from South Africa. But let me ask you about the front page of The Telegraph, that pill, because that is a piece of good news, I assume. What does this pill actually do, Jessica?
Yes, the pill is one that might otherwise have been given to people in hospital once their COVID develops and becomes severe. But now it's going to be given to people who are immunocompromised, people who are clinically vulnerable. If they're infected with COVID, they can get it to treat themselves at home, maybe within 48 hours of a test. So that's another sort of egg that the government's putting in its basket, which all the eggs are in this basket, of treatments and vaccines rather than things like social distancing to combat this new threat.
To preserve Christmas. And of course, we learn that the Prime Minister is going to take a decision about Christmas very shortly before Christmas as to what's happened. But there's also this really important story I mentioned about the Number 10 party. And ministers talk about this being tittle-tattle. But it's important, isn't it, because of people are going to have to listen to the Prime Minister and obey what he says, and the more they hear about this, the less likely they're to do that.
That's right, and I think what's getting confused is that this year we are allowed currently to have Christmas parties. Last year, on December the 18th, they were criminalised and people were being fined for holding Christmas parties. And apparently there was a Christmas party or a party of some sort in Number 10 Downing Street. Now, the official response is that all the rules were followed, but people can't understand. If they were following the rules, how did the party go ahead? And so this is significant because, firstly, lots of people were fined over having Christmas parties. Secondly, and this is critical for the government, there were people who were not allowed to see family members at that point. And the Sunday Mirror draws attention to an absolutely tragic but symbolic story about an 86-year-old woman, Beryl Harris, who died in hospital of COVID on December the 18th, the same day that there was apparently this knees up in Number 10. And her daughter is saying, how did my mum die without me being able to be with her? But the people who were supposed to be protecting her were having a gathering. And that's one of the significant questions that the Prime Minister and the government have to answer.
Well, I'll be talking to the Deputy Prime Minister, Dominic Raab, about this later on. But just to be absolutely clear, the dilemma we all have is how it is possible to have a party, you know, where drinks were being taken and games were being played and so forth without it breaking the rules. I think nobody outside the government understands how that's possible.
Nobody can understand how they had an exemption on this because they claim that the rules were being followed. And the third reason why this is so important is because, as you say, The Sunday Times this morning, Tim Shipman, who of course is very well connected, knows the inside story on these things, chief political commentator, says that December the 18th, so exactly a year on, this year, Boris Johnson will make a decision about what is going to happen for this Christmas.
Just a few days before Christmas, very late for most of us.
And of course, there is this persistent point that the government makes one set of rules for all of us, but there is a special set of rules which is followed by those at the top. And so if he wants people to obey the rules, and at the moment there's quite a light touch of rules, there are masks, of course, indoors in shops and on public transport, and there are certain travel restrictions. But if he's going to introduce more rules which would restrict our Christmas, people could quite rightly say, well, hang on a moment, last Christmas you didn't follow the rules, so why should we follow them this Christmas?
Jessica, do you think we're at a moment of public pushback if there's more rules and people just exhausted, fed up, frustrated and will behave, as it were, less obediently than they did a year ago?
I looked at some polling on this for a piece that I did on Friday, and it's really interesting to see how the polling around whether there should be new restrictions in hasn't really shifted since the summer. People are against much further restrictions than we've got now, and generally you used to see public support for it when things got more worrying. But the fact that Omicron doesn't seem to have turned the dial that much, I think should be something quite worrying for the government.
Basically, if people are really, really scared, they will accept restrictions.
And that
but if
might
they're
change.
not, they may well not, particularly if the government isn't behaving as it wants the rest of us to.
And one of the people who's really been affected during this pandemic is my colleague Kate Garraway, of course.
We've had her on the programme, yes, talking about Derek Draper, her husband.
Because he is one of the worst affected patients from COVID who survived. And he is, of course, at home right now. And there's a piece in the Mail on Sunday this morning because, of course, she is about to take over Life Stories, Piers Morgan's programme on ITV, and his very last Life Stories interview is with Kate, and a huge amount of it, of course, is about Derek. And she talks about the fact that most of the time Derek is not able to communicate
not able to
with
speak
her.
at all.
Very occasionally he'll say those three precious words, I love you. And it's just, it's such an emotional story. I was there in the audience with her children. And it's an incredibly moving story, and she's been so resilient throughout
We do
this
try
pandemic.
to bring you on this programme some of the good news stories as well. Jessica, I don't know if the government regards it as a good news story, but they did make a change of policy last night, didn't they, on travel restrictions?
Yes, and already, of course, plenty of people in this country's Christmas have been ruined. We've got a big South African and African population who might have been planning to see family for Christmas, and they now can't do so because of these new restrictions. But they've also got introduced these new restrictions for testing, pre-departure testing, something that Labour's been calling for, lateral flow
2
or
weeks, yes.
for about 2 weeks, lateral flow or PCR testing, which means you'll have to take one just before you travel to the country. Will it ruin people's Christmas? I don't know if extra testing will, but it's certainly going to add on to the beleaguered travel industry.
But it is something that we all had to get used to earlier in the year, and we all did if we were coming into the country or coming out of the country. Let's talk about, I said earlier on in the programme that this was going to be a big crime week for the government, lots of announcements on crime, and there's an interview in The Sun with the Prime Minister. David Wooding of The Sun has interviewed the Prime Minister. The drugs don't work is the main headline. Just, Susanna, explain to us what that's about.
Yes, it's a big commitment to crack down, unleash an all-out war on drugs. This week is the way that it's being sold. A drive to clean up Britain's crime-plagued streets. Cracking down on drugs, cracking down on this sort of crime is obviously going to play to his base. It's very popular, but there are a couple of extra lines in this piece. And Mr Johnson also promised action to create safer streets for women and girls and restore public confidence in the police, which was shattered by the murder of Sarah Everard by the Met officer Wayne Couzens. He says pestering women in the street of pubs and making lewd comments could also become an offence. Mr Johnson said there's a big public outcry about Sarah Everard's death. The public are never wrong. Well, I mean, he's absolutely right. There was a massive outcry. I think
But it was a bit different, wasn't it? I mean, it's a slightly different issue from wolf whistling.
So To conflate the two is disingenuous. I mean, the Met have serious questions to answer about why Wayne Couzens was able to do what he did when complaints had been made about him in the run-up to Sarah Everard's death. But I also think that there are questions to answer about huge cuts in the Crown Prosecution Service, and under austerity 20,000 police officers have been cut. So I think if you say the public are never wrong, if you ask the public, would you like more police officers, they would definitely say yes, in their thousands.
But for an awful lot of women, you know, comments made in the street, low-level harassment in the street is part of a culture of hostility from some men, which is very, very damaging. And the case, you know, you're not allowed to shout racist things in the street, but you are allowed to shout sexist things in the street. And bringing those two into line, for a lot of people, I imagine, is quite a sensible thing to do.
Well, I'm sure that a lot of people will find that would make them a lot more comfortable, because it can be very uncomfortable if you are harassed in that way in the street. But currently, rape convictions are at a terrible low. I mean, just a fraction of those people who go and report a rape eventually see a conviction. So if we could have more resources...
There are some measures coming in on that, aren't there, about pre-recorded interviews?
Absolutely, and he has pledged to change some of the rules about the evidence in order to make that, and that, I think, will be extremely welcome.
And I think it's worth saying as well that people have tried to introduce this into the House of Commons before. They've tried to make amendments to make misogyny a hate crime, and the government has blocked those from happening. So let's see what the Prime Minister actually does when he says the public are never wrong, because he's been fairly tone-deaf on this so far.
We're nearly out of time, but just before we... There's been a story in the Sunday Times about drug use in the House of Commons at the same time as this middle class thing. Lots and lots of drugged up, coked up people staggering around the House of Commons, we read, and they're even bringing in sniffer dogs.
Yes, so the Speaker of the House of Commons says that he's concerned about it, and I mean, that lots of the bars in the House of Commons have been closed over the period of time, but there certainly has been lots of incidents in the past in the House of Commons bars, including punch-ups and whatsoever. So maybe if there are a few sniffer dogs patrolling, we might get slightly better behaved MPs.
So is this a message that he's sending out to people closer to home, where drugs don't work?
Well, thank you both very much indeed for that. And so to the weather. Some people are still suffering from the effects of Storm Arwen, and we are expecting more stormy weather in the week ahead. Chris Fawkes is in the weather studio this morning. Chris.
We are indeed, Andrew. Tuesday's the one to watch for those strong winds returning. But for today, an east-west split with the weather pattern. Eastern areas cloudy with some patchy outbreaks of rain. For most of us, though, the weather will brighten up, but the best of the sunshine today will always be across more western areas. So this rain gets a little less widespread, I think, through the day, and it will tend to brighten for these areas. But it's across Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, southwest England, where showers clear off. The afternoon dry, lots of sunshine. And it's going to be a fine winter kind of day, really. Temperatures around about 6 or 7 degrees, fairly widely, and 9 or 10 towards southern Wales, southwest England, where it's going to be at its mildest, but the wind's still quite gusty around coasts of Wales and England. Overnight tonight, it turns chilly for a time, with some patchy frost developing under briefly clear skies. But then later in the night, a band of rain moves in off the Atlantic, and as that starts to bump into the cold air, there's the potential for it to turn to snow, particularly across parts of Scotland, where north of the central belt we could be looking at around 5 centimetres in places, so some tricky travelling conditions. Even over the southern uplands, the peaks and the Pennines, there is potential for a spell of snow for a time. Otherwise, it's cold rain that we'll get from this cold front. Behind that, sunshine and showers, turning much colder tomorrow, particularly across northern areas, with temperatures of around 4 or 5 degrees Celsius. But then, Andrew, you mentioned the stormy weather. That's on the way for Tuesday. We see a return of some very strong winds midweek. Andrew.
And there were some quite strong winds first thing this morning. Now, the bad news is that cases of Omicron are spreading very fast in South Africa, and it has become the dominant strain of coronavirus there. But the consequences, if it does the same in the UK, are still not clear. Earlier, I spoke to 2 scientists who are trying to find out about that. In a few minutes, you will hear from Professor Mark Woolhouse, who advises the government here by modelling what might happen if with this new variant. But first, I spoke to Willem Hanekom, the director of the Africa Health Research Institute in South Africa. The world is watching his team of scientists as they work around the clock to find out more about the Omicron variant.
We know three things that we didn't know last week. So the first thing is that the virus is spreading extraordinarily fast in South Africa. The increase in cases is much steeper than it's been in the past three waves. So it seems that Omicron is able to spread very easily. And virtually all the cases that we see in South Africa right now are Omicron. The second thing we have data on is reinfections. So as you know, after you've had COVID, you have about a 1% chance, or perhaps even less than 1% chance of getting reinfected and even getting disease again caused by this virus. The third little bit of data that we have already relates to clinical cases and how severe the disease is. The early data suggests that the disease may occur more in younger people and in people, mostly younger people that are unvaccinated, and that overall, so far, the disease has appeared to be milder. But again, I want to say we have to be cautious. These are very early days.
So, of course, the thing that everybody watching is going to be thinking about is what's the effect on vaccinated people. So how many people with Omicron in South Africa have been vaccinated?
So I cannot give you that exact figure, but I think that anecdotally, in speaking to clinicians who are working in hospitals where these cases have been admitted, a large proportion of people that have been admitted have not been vaccinated. So it's the same story as what we have known before from vaccines, it seems. And the story is that vaccines protect against severe disease and death, and therefore vaccines are still absolutely critical.
Now, you've broken down the biology of the new variant, and you know that it seems to evade people who've been, or infect people who've been infected with coronavirus before. Does that mean that it's going to evade the vaccines or not? Is that a completely different issue?
So the vaccines may be less effective, but the important point is that most vaccinologists still believe that the vaccines will still protect against severe disease and death. And that is really why we're giving vaccines for COVID.
Now, you said earlier on that it was spreading astonishingly fast. Are we absolutely sure that it outcompetes the other variants?
So it's difficult to say in South Africa because it's difficult to conclude that it has outcompeted Delta, which of course was the previous variant that was very prevalent here. Because at the time that Omicron emerged, the number of infections were extraordinarily low. And Omicron is a completely different lineage. So we don't actually know at the moment whether it has outcompeted. Perhaps we will get some experience in other countries where Omicron has spread to see whether it would be able to outcompete Delta.
Professor, as I mentioned at the beginning of the interview, the world is watching you and your team, and the world is wondering whether vaccines are going to work against Omicron. When do you think you might have answers?
So we will have answers from various sources. The first is big vaccine effectiveness studies that are ongoing in South Africa. We've got surveillance systems, and we should have data surrounding vaccine effectiveness on a population basis within about a month, if not a little bit earlier. And then one can also look at vaccines in the lab. You can look at whether antibodies are able to control the virus in the lab. We call it a neutralization assay, by using plasma, which is a blood product from previously vaccinated people, and seeing how well that plasma would work against the virus that you grow out in the lab or that you make in the lab to copy Omicron. And those results should be out within a week already.
Professor Hanekom, thanks for the moment very much. Professor Willem Hanekom, Director of the Africa Health Research Institute. And listening to that is Professor Mark Woolhouse, the Government Advisor and author of a book about the extraordinary events of the last year, The Year the World Went Mad. Professor, based on what you've heard from Professor Hanekom, are you expecting Omicron to become the dominant variant in the United Kingdom?
It's certainly a possibility, Andrew. As we've heard, the Omicron variant is highly transmissible. It appears to be spreading very rapidly in South Africa, and the early signs are that it's spreading pretty rapidly in the UK too. If those trends continue, then over the course of the coming weeks and months, Omicron could even come to replace Delta entirely right around the world.
You say it's spreading very rapidly. Do you think it could be much more widespread than we think?
The Health Security Agency has reported, as of Friday, over 100 confirmed cases of Omicron in the UK, right across the country, but with concentration slightly in London and in Scotland. It's not clear yet exactly what fraction of all the cases that represents, but we have hints because there is a diagnostic shortcut, something called an S gene dropout, that allows us to get an early impression of how many possible Omicron cases there are, even without sequencing. And those S gene dropout cases are also increasing quite fast.
And I think these S gene dropout cases are in London, the southeast of England and the East Midlands. Is that right?
Well, and in Scotland, they're all over the country. We always got a few of them, even with Delta, which is not an S gene dropout variant. But they have been picking up. But the numbers are still quite small. So the absolute number of Omicron cases in the UK, I would still suspect is more in the hundreds than the thousands. The important point is that they're growing, and they're growing quite fast.
Now, you were listening to Professor Hanekom there, and he was saying, first of all, that this does evade the immunity built up by people who'd had the virus previously. Do you think, from what you've heard, that there is a serious danger it evades vaccines as well?
The vaccinologists and the immunologists think that they won't, this variant won't evade the vaccines entirely. And it's important to remember that against the Delta variant, which is a different variant itself, the booster vaccinations in particular have turned out to be very, very effective, well into the 90% protection against infection, but also against disease and putting people in hospital. So even if the vaccines were just slightly less effective against Omicron, they would still be very, very good.
Last night, the government changed the rules so that travellers arriving in the UK have to take a COVID test before departure. Does that make any difference at this point?
I think that may be a case of shutting the stable door after the horse has bolted. If Omicron is here in the UK, it certainly is, if there's community transmission in the UK, and it certainly looks that way, then it's that community transmission that will drive the next wave. The cases that are being imported are important. We want to detect those and isolate any positive cases that we find, as we would for any case anywhere. But I think it's too late to make a material difference to the course of the Omicron wave if we're going to have one.
All right, Professor Woolhouse, thanks very much indeed for talking to us. Listening to that again was Professor Hanekom. Now, Professor Hanekom, there has been some suggestion from South Africa that you feel the rest of the world is panicking unnecessarily about Omicron. What is your view?
I'm completely aligned with that view of my colleagues within South Africa. I think especially the travel bans are going to do very, very little to stop the spread of Omicron. In fact, our experience is exactly the opposite. They're not going to do anything to stop the spread of Omicron. But in a country like South Africa, which is a middle income country, the amount that we are losing economically from travel bans, it's just astronomical, and we really cannot afford that.
Because you see, our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, argues that that might be true, but stopping people coming in stops the spread of the seed and buys us time.
You have just heard from your colleague in the UK that this is not really where the focus should be to ultimately control the epidemic within the UK. I do not want to speak for the UK, but I think the other measures may have to be put into place if you want to control Omicron within your country.
Professors Hanekom and Woolhouse, thank you both very much indeed for talking to us. The name Arthur Labinho Hughes will not be forgotten. This week, his father was jailed for 21 years for his manslaughter and his partner jailed for 29 years for Arthur's murder. Later this morning, the Prime Minister is expected to announce an inquiry into the case. The job of the Children's Commissioner is to promote and protect the rights of children, especially the most vulnerable. The current Commissioner, Dame Rachel de Souza, is with me in the studio. Dame Rachel, welcome. What could have been done to help Arthur?
Look, first, I think it's so important we're here talking about Arthur's case. The life of a child is of inestimable value, and his voice was not heard, and that's where we need to start. Obviously, there's a serious case review underway, and we need to see what that says, but we must take decisive action, and now. Now, my concern is that here we are, 20 years since this post was set up, and we're still having these cases, and there are two things that I think we absolutely have to do and do now. One, what Arthur raised concern. He was not a baby. He was 6 years old. He raised concern and the system did not hear him. We must listen to the voices of children. And secondly, we're no doubt with these reviews and national reviews that are absolutely right that they happen, they tend to make the same recommendations. My challenge to the system is going to be, we need to, and this is what I've done, is go look at the best places where social care is delivered. Look at it. It's not a matter of system recommendations. It's a matter of delivery. When I go to the best places in this country, do you know what I see? I see people inquisitive about children. I see managers asking the right questions. I see
so a lack of curiosity
that
really has been the problem here, because after all, it wasn't just Arthur. You know, his grandmother raised concerns about bruises, and his uncle contacted the police, and still nothing was done.
And that's why that professional curiosity is critical, but the system must support social workers' professional curiosity, not distract them on other things. You know, I've had 30 years in education reform and seen many of these cases. Education's unrecognisable because we reformed and focused on children in the classroom. We need to see this in children's social care as well. It's happening, and but what I'll tell you is this is not a quick fix, an easy recommendation. The best places in the country that do this have taken 3, 4, 5 years to do this. It's a big job, but we must do it for Arthur.
Change.
For Arthur, we have to do it.
Now, another reason behind this, I don't want to suggest that he died for any other reason, that two evil people killed him, and we should always remember that. Nonetheless, this all happened during lockdown, or a lot of it did. He wasn't going into school where things might have been picked up, and social workers at that period were not allowed to go to houses in person to check up on children. And so the terrible question I have to ask is, do you think there are other awful things going on up and down the country that have been hidden by the pandemic?
I think there's no doubt that lockdown was such a shock to the whole nation that it weakened the system of support. But actually, in Arthur's case, he did have a number of professionals around him. He did have home visits. We have to wait to hear exactly what's happened there. And what I would say, I was in school during the lockdown. I went into school every single day. And I know my colleagues were picking up the slack and going out and seeing and checking on children they think were the most vulnerable. It was a terrible time. It was a terrible time for the whole nation. It's also why I think we must not close schools again. You know, we must not.
So that comes to my next question, because everybody hopes there is not going to be pressure for new lockdown and new restrictions and the Omicron threat goes away again in some form. But it is possible that at some time before too long, the Prime Minister will say to you and to the rest of us, I'm really, really sorry, but this is such a serious threat, the Omicron variant, that we are going to have to close schools again. What would you say to him?
Well, I mean, I would urge him not to close schools. And let me just give you a sense of this. I mean, coming out of lockdown, I went and put out a survey to the children of England and got more than 500,000 responses. That's the biggest survey ever in England and probably across the world. And do you know what the children told me? How that their biggest concerns, their mental health and well-being from being away from school, from their friends, their concerns about their education, their concerns about not being able to be together out and play. They want things back to normal. They took a huge hit for us. We must not close schools again. And my head teacher colleagues across the country are incredibly good at managing this situation. I watch them rush into support the most vulnerable. And I would definitely advise not to do this, and if there is any other option.
Well, let's talk about, there's always other options, and I'm just wondering what you think the rest of us, the government, society generally, should be prepared to do to ensure that schools stay open and that these children, who will never get their education back fully, don't have to go through that again.
Yeah, I mean, frankly, whilst online learning was put into place and everybody stepped up to try to do that, children have told me, that's 500,000 children have told me, that although that was helpful, it could not replace what a teacher taught them.
So we should accept more restrictions to keep schools open, perhaps.
I think children have done a huge amount for us. They've made a great... I have 250,000 text responses, children telling me how they miss their older relatives, how they miss funerals, how they don't know how to make friends anymore. And, real concerns. I went around the country in April and May, from Grimsby to Scunthorpe to Bristol to Handsworth, and talked to hundreds of children. We can't let them down. We need. As long as we can keep them safe, and nothing is ever 100% safe, we need schools open.
Now, right at this moment, in England alone, 208,000 children are not at school. That's more than twice the normal absentee. First of all, why is that happening, do you think?
Yes, so, let's put that into context. So, normally around this sort of time, you'd have 94% of children in school in a normal year. We're now about at sort of high 80s. So most children are in school. Most children want to be in school. Now, why are children not in school? Some of it is COVID. Some of it are other reasons. And one thing that my office is doing, and I know the Department for Education are doing, and I know that ministers are taking incredibly seriously, and I urge them to take even more seriously, is digging down into the why. Is it because, as a head, we've often seen, we just need to go out there and get them in. There's kids who've just not come back or should be there. There's not a problem.
And had to be cajoled in, as it were.
Is it because there are mental health or mental well-being concerns? Then let's get the support in place.
Do you think
COVID?
I'm so sorry. Do you think parents are being too cautious sometimes? A tickle of a cough, a bit of a runny nose, and they're kept away from school because it might be COVID, and you would urge them to send them anyway.
I think everybody naturally has had terrible shock because of COVID. They're worried, they hear things on the media. I would say, you've got your lateral flow tests, take your tests and get into school, and encourage children to get into school. It's the best place for them, and frankly, it's what they've told me, it's what they want, it's where they want to be.
Now, one suggestion is that vaccinating 5 to 11-year-olds would really help. I wonder what your attitude is to that.
So I always would take that on. I'm not a scientist, so I take the scientific advice, and I'm looking forward to seeing what JCVI say. What I would say, two things. One is children have told me anecdotally, as I went around the country, that they would like the vaccine because they want to support their older relatives. This is an altruistic nation, young generation. We need to be very grateful to them. But also, a number of countries have gone ahead of us, and we can see the scientific outcomes of that. So my view is very much, if JVCI say yes, let's do it. Let's let children who want it have it.
Children's Commissioner for England, Dame Rachel de Souza, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Now then, here's a look at what's on BBC One at 10:30 this morning.
Coming up on Sunday Morning Live, singer-songwriter Alex Clare will be here to tell us what happens when you put faith before fame.
And with the changing COVID landscape, we'll be asking if we can really have a normal Christmas this year.
And Sally Phillips explores the philosophy of being funny with Blackadder and QI creator John Lloyd. Join us at 10:30.
Very clever man, John Lloyd. Joanna Lumley occupies the kind of treasured status that few people in public life attain, whether as an actor or campaigner, TV travel presenter, model or writer. She has been loved and admired by millions in all the roles she plays. Her latest passion has been to bring together a collection of writings about the Queen in time for next year's Platinum Jubilee. When we met, Joanna started by explaining what made her want to compile the book A Queen for All Seasons.
Sometimes I think people think that she seems remote, but she's just doing her queenly duty. And then underneath it, which is why I really wanted to do this book, I wanted to find out what she's really like, because we mostly see her in ceremonial thing or courteously going down, shaking hands, doing opening of parliaments or whatever. I just wanted to find what she was like at other times.
But you, of course, have had the chance to meet her.
I have.
A few times. Now, do you find it easy to talk to her What happens?
It's extremely terrifying. For some reason, it is, even though people say, oh, what an honour, oh, you'll love it, she's so friendly. No matter how much of that goes on, you're absolutely terrified. The first time you see the Queen, you have, it's almost like an electric shock, because something so familiar, somebody so familiar, is suddenly in front of you. Andrew, this is an odd thing to say, but the first time I met you, I went, oh my God, that's Andrew Marr. And I'm speaking to him because you, on television, are slightly different from how you are in real life.
In real life, I'm very fat and very short.
A million times more beautiful. But the Queen is suddenly just a different dimension, a different size, and a different... People always say her eyes are so blue, so stunning. When she looks at you, her eyes are so blue. And so you have that sort of shock, and you immediately start being rather dim and rather babbly.
And you've always found something appropriate to say to her at the time?
No, never. And I went to one of the lunches at Buckingham Palace, and for some extraordinary reason, I said, Your Majesty, and curtsy and so on, and she said, do tell me what you're doing nowadays. And I said, I'm very concerned about legalising drugs. I mean, what had happened to me? It's as if she would care. She had no interest in it. Anyway, she let me babble on for a little bit, because she's very good at listening to people. She's very good at listening.
Right now, we're at a time when an awful lot of people, including people watching this show, get their idea about the Queen and about the royal family from fiction, from The Crown, the very, very successful Netflix series. Now, it must be a very strange thing, I imagine, seeing your own life fictionalised while you're still alive on screen. What are your feelings about that?
I did watch the first series, whatever it was, of The Crown, but I have stopped watching it. In a funny way, Andrew, the truth is that I know pretty much all the royal family. Have met them, I don't know them. You never really know the royal family. But I've been lucky enough to know and have friendships with some of them. And I can't bear the thought of people pretending they know what they say in private to each other, or, I don't know, it just seems a bit odd.
And do you think it sort of damaged the image of the royal family, this fictionalisation?
I'm sure it has. I think it probably has, because whatever they're saying and doing isn't what happened, so it's not the truth.
Talking about the royal family and not just the Queen, it's the Platinum Jubilee coming up, and it comes up at a time which is really, really hard for the royal family at the moment. You know, you've got the court cases, you've got the endless reporting of the younger princes and so forth. How damaging is that, and how much do you think that hurts the Queen herself?
I don't know, it's quite hard to tell. The Queen seems unassailable, no matter what people have to say about whether they're monarchists or not, and Republicans and people around the world, everybody who's got bad things to say about the royal family, mostly they haven't got that to say about the Queen. Most people now realise that she's a completely exceptional person. And so that's what I tried to focus on in the book. I said it's not about the royal family, it's not about politics, it's not even about monarchy. It's about this particular person and how she's managed to carry the trappings of state like an enormous burden, like that figure of Atlas carrying the world.
Yes.
The Queen going on and on and on and never giving up.
You don't think republicanism will come back in this country?
I don't know. I think one can nowadays particularly, never second guess the future. We all thought we'd be out of lockdown now, Andrew, and look, we can hear the clink and the clank of chains.
So, Joanna, what do you think? Because we've had all the ghastly Harry and Meghan business and the rest, and she is Delphic. She gives nothing away, absorbing it all, taking it all. What do you think's going on inside her? I
don't know. I hope her Christian faith looks after her, and I think that no matter what we read through the newspapers or report through tittle-tattle, is that probably isn't really what's going on, and probably the royal family is much closer than we think, I think.
But Joanna Lumley, it's always such a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Andrew.
The Deputy Prime Minister and Justice Secretary, Dominic Raab, is my last guest this morning. Dominic Raab, welcome to you.
Good morning.
Is Omicron more widespread in this country than we had thought?
Well, look, we know we've had, I think, just a little over 150 cases. So those are the facts. The impact we're still gauging, as your guests today have shown. I think the real truth of the matter is that one thing people seem pretty confident about is that increasing the take-up of boosters and vaccines. We're now at 80% double jabbed. A third of the country have had the third jab or a booster is the surest defences. We can go into this Christmas totally different position from the last Christmas.
Relaxed about Christmas. Is it going to be a good one?
I think it's going to be a great Christmas. Look, all the family, friends, loved ones that being able to get together in a way we haven't been able to do for a couple of years, I think is really important. Of course, we'll continue to be vigilant about variants, but the reality is, and you can look at the data this week on last week, hospitalisations down, deaths down, we stay vigilant, but I think we're in a much more confident position because of the vaccine, because of the boosters.
So knowing what you know about Omicron, you would be perfectly relaxed and happy about going to see an elderly relative this Christmas?
Yes, I mean, of course, it always depends a little bit on their personal condition. If they're safeguarding, it may be different. But I think people should enjoy Christmas, get their loved ones around them, celebrate it in a way we haven't been able to in the past.
And that's despite the fact that we heard earlier on in the programme that Omicron is spreading and speeding at an astonishing rate in South Africa. It goes very, very fast indeed. And that people who've had coronavirus already can be reinfected, and that we know some people who have had vaccines are being infected. Those three things seem to be quite worrying.
Well, look, all of those caveats and qualifications apply. That's why we need to stay eternally vigilant. That's why we've taken some measures in relation to transport. That's why some of those countries, even if it's residual defence against reseeding in this country, have been put on the transport blacklist. But
closing the door after the horse has bolted, said Mark Woolhouse.
Well, you always get the Goldilocks criticism of we've done too much, we've done too little. The reality is, I think if you look at the hospitalisation rate, the fatality rate, all down this week on last week, the latest statistics, if you look at the success of the vaccine scheme, 80% plus of not just adults but those over 12 double jabbed, the boosters and the third jabs out to a third of the country. Actually, we have steadily and patiently but steadfastly created the resilience and the defences which mean we can enjoy Christmas.
You're putting everything into vaccines as the line of defence, really. If they don't work, what next? Are you contingency planning for a serious new wave?
Well, look, we're always watching the variants. I'm not sure it's quite right to say that everything has gone into vaccines, but the big focus, the big priority has been that. But we've also talked about therapeutics, the drugs that mean that even if transmission spreads, it is no more harmful than, say, ordinary flu because you take the fatality out of it. That's been important. And we've, of course, with testing, we're in just a totally different place with the lateral flow test, but also we've taken extra measures in relation to travel. I know that's going to upset or disrupt some people, but I think it's all part of the jigsaw that goes to a strategy which has put us in a much more confident place so we can enjoy Christmas, we can, and also for the economy, jobs up, growth up, wages up. We're doing the right things, I think, in the right way. Was your colleague Grant Shapps, the Transport Secretary, right when he said just 2 days ago that doing this would kill off the travel sector? Well, look, the Grant is very plugged into the travel sector. Of course, he's right to articulate the commercial interest. I think, though, that the worst thing would be to then lurch, having not taken incremental steps that can make a difference, even if it's only at the margins in the way your guest described. I think we want to make sure we take those steps earlier, precisely to avoid the bigger disruption to travel and the economy. Is it right that the government are going to look again at all of this, look at the possible restrictions on the 18th of December? Look, we keep the restrictions constantly under review, but we're at plan A. Because that's a week before Christmas. Yes, but if we weren't constantly looking, engaging, people will be asking the question. So that's the normal course of events, but we're in plan A. We haven't even had to revert to some of the measures that were described in plan B. And I think, again, that's testament to the success of the vaccine rollout and the plans that we've put in place, but also then just delivered over the last year. Now, I said at the beginning of the programme there had been contradictory advice from the government over all of this, the future. We have the Deputy Prime Minister here, so you can give us definitive answers, I am sure. So the head of the Health Security Agency, Dr. Jenny Harris, says, don't socialise if you don't need to. The Prime Minister says, go to parties. Who's right? No, people should go to the parties, the events. She's wrong. Well, no, I don't know. I don't have the full context for what she said. And of course, the scientific advisors, the public health advisors will caveat very carefully what they say. But our message is this: enjoy Christmas this year. The vaccine rollout means we're in a position to do so. And also, although I know you like to have the definitive answers to everything from the DPM, but we're also saying that employers can be trusted to take some let me finish that. Can be trusted to take common sense approach to the factors, the circumstances in their businesses and in their sectors. So on employers, the business secretary said small parties fine, big parties don't.
Do you agree with that?
I believe in trusting employers to get the common sense balance and not second guessing them with every different decision in regard to this. And our overwhelming advice is enjoy Christmas, go to those events. People need to see that social interaction, whether it's at work or amongst family and friends.
Well, let's get to a more intimate question. The Work and Pension Secretary says, don't kiss people under the mistletoe. The Health Secretary says, kiss who you like.
Look, I'm not going to start telling people who and who they can't kiss. The parties are fine. Enjoy being amongst loved ones this Christmas. It is not the job of the government to micromanage all of these different common sense judgments. We set the framework, we give advice, but we also trust people to enjoy things and do things in a responsible way. And we understand that whatever the rules say, there is still a little bit of nervousness out there. And we understand that.
All right, let's move from this Christmas to last Christmas and last Christmas party. Very straightforward question. Last Christmas, were Christmas parties allowed in London?
So look, if you're so generally no.
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 Generally no. And yet we know there was a Christmas party at number 10. So how did that not break the rule?
Look, I'm not going to say anything beyond what the PM has said in relation to this. We've got, let's just be clear what we're talking about here. Something that took place a year ago,
yes.
Unsubstantiated,
and people were dying.
Unsubstantiated, anonymous claims being made. The PM has been crystal clear in relation to any circumstances, events in Downing Street that the rules were complied with, and the police have been very clear. They'll look at any letter, but they don't normally look back and investigate things that have taken place a year ago. I don't think.
Well,
in the absence of some form of
retrospective to one side. That's a strange thing for the police to say, but let's leave that to one side. Let's remind ourselves what the legal position was a year ago.
Sure.
Here we go. You must not have a work Christmas lunch or party where that is a primarily social activity and is not otherwise permitted by the rules in your tier. London was in tier 3, so it definitely was not permitted. Now, the BBC has spoken to serious sources there who say that was drink and food and party games. It was a party. And I come back to this really dilemma we all have. Number 10 says no rules were broken. If there was a party, then rules were broken. If there wasn't a party, then rules weren't broken. Was there a party?
Wait, but you've just given me, you referred to reports. They're anonymous, they're unsubstantiated. No, with respect, Andrew, you've pointed to a rather caveated set of guidance, which we all look at and work out how to balance. And the PM's been very clear, no rules were broken.
So
I wasn't there, by the way, so I can't give you
all the reports, because multiple people have reports. The Financial Times, not a tabloid newspaper. The Mirror, a tabloid newspaper. The BBC, Laura Koonsberg, a very, very experienced and plugged-in reporter, all report the same things. But you are telling us definitively this morning that that party never happened.
But all the reports.
Well, I'm asking you, did it happen or not? You must know.
I don't know because I wasn't there, so I can't give you first-hand...
You're Deputy Prime Minister, you must ask people.
Well, I do, and what I know is that you've got, from all the sources you refer to, unsubstantiated claims being made, and all on the basis of anonymous sources. It's impossible, actually, to answer the charge on that basis, other than to say we're clear that the rules were followed.
But you are surrounded by people in number 10 the whole time. You must have asked people at some point, if only out of natural human curiosity, did this party happen?
Actually, we've been getting on with the job of the criminal justice...
Never occurred to you to ask about it?
I watch all of the flurry of accusations, counterclaims that are made, but the truth is, until there's something substantiated, until it's more than the anonymous sources that I think, in fairness, you've described, I don't think we're chasing the shadows. What I'm focused on is the criminal justice work that we're doing on victims, on drugs, on prisons, on the terrible cases that we've seen with baby Arthur and baby and Tony Hudgell, which I was addressing this week. So forgive me, I've got lots on my plate. I'm not chasing the unsubstantiated, anonymous reports that you've referred to.
All right. You are a professional lawyer. Can we at least agree that if the party took place, it was breaking the rules?
Well, if there's a breach of the rules, there's a breach of the rules. That's circular, Andrew, but I don't know the full facts because I wasn't there.
So the answer to my question is yes, if there was a party, it was breaking the ruls.
Well, as you said, the definition on the guidance that you've just shown needs to be applied. It was quite heavily caveated, actually. But look, of course, if there was a formal party held, of course, that's something that was clearly contrary to the guidance that you just cited.
The rest of us were told we could not party, we could not socialise. Up and down the country, people were dying at the time that party took place. If there was a party, can you at least condemn it? So that was the wrong thing to do.
Look, if anyone held a party contrary to the rules, of course that's the wrong thing to do. But Andrew, as a lawyer and as a politician, it's not a responsible thing to start answering hypothetical questions about anonymous sources in relation to unsubstantiated claims. You know that.
But we can agree it was wrong. If it happened, it was wrong.
If something unsubstantiated from anonymous sources actually materialised, then of course it would be wrong.
All right. Let's move on to schools.
Yes.
There are 208,000 children out of school at the moment in England alone. Why was that? Why has that happened, and what can you do to get those numbers down?
In relation, you're talking in relation to COVID?
Yeah.
Yeah, look, of course, the school's done an amazing job. We've got more testing being done. I think the schools want to be very careful in relation to the spread of the virus. But actually, the vast majority, the overwhelming majority of children are in school. That's the right place for them to be. And with the extension of vaccines to the over 12s, 80% now covered with 2 jabs, the third with the boosters and the third jab, actually we're in a much better position. But of course, the winter months have always been the point of higher risk. The scientists have always warned that.
Those children are never going to get their education back. The Children's Commissioner has said schools should never be shut in this way again. Do you agree with that?
Look, saying ironclad and never in relation to the future, I think is always difficult. But I share my instincts are all in the same place as that. And as someone with young children, I think we want our kids back at school, and we need to make that a top priority.
Let's talk about the crime agenda then directly.
Please.
Should wolf whistling and catcalling at women become a criminal offence?
Well, we've got very strong laws already in place to make sure any intimidation and harassment of women in anywhere in our society are dealt with and addressed. I think actually the big focus that we're looking at this week is how we deal with the very serious cases. So, for example, I'm going to be hosting a tech summit on rape prosecutions tomorrow. One of the things we're looking at is how we can use tech better, both when it comes to taking evidence from mobile phones from a victim that comes forward. We want victims to have the confidence to come forward. That means that they shouldn't be left without their phone for too long, because that deters them from coming forward, right the way through to the ability to give evidence in a pre-recorded way, not in the glare of the courtroom. And we know that that will bring down what's called victim attrition, which means victims falling out of the process, and secure more prosecutions and more guilty pleas. So we're absolutely focused on driving up prosecutions and accountability for victims.
That is a very serious issue, but I come back to my original question. Wolf whistling and the sexist abuse of women on the streets, are you going to make that a new criminal offence?
It is already a criminal offence, and I think we've got to be very careful that we make sure we enforce the laws that we've got, rather than thinking that
wolf whistling is already a criminal offence.
If anything is done on the street that results in harassment of a woman, intimidation, and of course these depend on the circumstances, it's already a public order offence. But what we've got to do is make sure, I mean, if you look at the serious violence,
so there's not going to be a new offence and not going to be a change in the law on this.
I'll always look at any case for securing greater protection for women. But our focus has been on, let me tell you what we are doing, criminal justice scorecards, both for generic crime but also for rape. So we can see where we're getting it right at the police, CPS, at the court stage. We're going to localise them in the new year so people can see from their region, their area, how we're doing. We're going to bring in for consultation this week, I'll be announcing, for consultation of victims law, so victims are at the heart of the process. And then there are those more operational, technical things like the so-called Section 28 pre-recorded victim evidence for those the victim of rape. These are the ways, the sort of, if you like, the levers, the policy measures that strategically as a jigsaw, if you like, we put together, and we will ramp up those prosecutions, give justice to victims, particularly of rape.
Now, when it comes to drug strategy, there seems to be an implication that you're going to move away from criminalising drug users and using the health system to deal with them instead. Is that, broadly speaking, true?
I don't think that's quite right, but we're going to have a new drug strategy announced very shortly. It will look at everything from cracking down on, frankly, the business model that drug dealers use, the so-called county lines. So you've got urban gangs, but they reach out into the suburbs and into the rural parts of the country. We want to be very clear on the sentences and the penalties. We don't think that so-called middle class taking of cocaine is somehow okay. So no, in that sense, we're going to be tough. But we're also looking at how we help addicts of drug addicts get free of their dependency. So just to give you one sense, and I'm going to be announcing a prisons white paper, HMP Alt Course in Liverpool has a drug recovery wing. So rather than just being stuck on methadone, which basically prevents harm, you've got a proper plan to get off drugs. I think we should be looking at expanding that right across the prison estate.
All right, very quickly, Arthur Lavignio Hughes. There are many people out there who think that the two people responsible for his torture and murder got lenient sentences, too lenient sentences. Are you one of them?
Yes, and my heart goes out for that little boy. Any child that's been the victim of abuse. We had Tony Hudgell and his parents come to see me. On relation to Tony's law, we've announced that we're going to raise the sentences for child cruelty. And in relation to baby Arthur, the attorney has already said that she's minded to submit an application for review of the sentence.
Dominic Raab, thanks very much indeed for coming in and talking to us. And that's all from me this week. Thanks to all of my guests, as ever, and to you for watching. Until next week, goodbye.